It was supposed to be a simple trip, nothing more than a quick afternoon of squirrel hunting. Johnny and I had been doing it since we were kids, head out to the woods, shoot a couple of squirrels, and head home with some good stories and a bit of game. These woods were familiar, practically in our backyard, so we never gave it much thought. But that afternoon, something was different. We parked the truck at the edge of the forest, just off an old dirt road that wound through miles of dense trees. The air was crisp, autumn just starting to settle in, and the sun was still high, casting warm rays through the canopy. The first hour or so went as expected. We'd gotten a couple of good shots, Johnny bragging about how he could outshoot me as usual. He'd bagged 2 squirrels already, while I was still searching for a decent target. "That's 2 for me," Johnny said with a grin, nudging me. "Better catch up." I laughed, but there was something about the way the woods felt today. The air seemed colder than it should have been, and the deeper we walked, the more unsettling the silence became. There was no rustling of leaves, no birds singing in the trees, just an eerie, oppressive quiet. "You feel that?" I asked, lowering my rifle. Johnny frowned. "Feel what?" "I don't know, man," I muttered, scanning the tree line. "Something's off." He shrugged it off. "You're just jumpy. It's just the woods." But it wasn't just the woods. I could feel it deep in my gut, like something was watching us. I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. The silence pressed in on us, and every step felt heavier than the last. The trees around us were thicker now, taller, their branches twisting in unnatural ways that made the shadows beneath them stretch long and dark. That's when we found the old camp. It was hidden in a small clearing, barely noticeable unless you were right on top of it. At first, I thought it was just an old fire pit and some rocks, but as we got closer, I realized it was more than that. The rocks were arranged in strange patterns, almost like symbols, and there were faded marks on the trees around the site, symbols I didn't recognize. "This looks old," Johnny said, kneeling down to examine the ground. "Real old." "Maybe we should head back," I said, feeling that creeping dread again. "This doesn't feel right." Johnny stood, brushing dirt off his hands. "It's just some old campsite. Probably Native American or something. Nothing to worry about." But it wasn't just an old campsite. As we turned to leave, a low, distant chant began to echo through the trees. It was faint at first, almost like the wind whispering through the branches, but it grew louder with each passing second. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Johnny's face went pale. "Yeah, I hear it." The chant was guttural, ancient, like a language we weren't meant to understand. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding us. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the trees, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just shadows and silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible between the thick trees. At first, I thought he was just a man, an old Native American, dressed in buckskins, his long black hair braided down his back. But as I looked closer, I realized something was horribly wrong. His eyes were empty, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light, and his skin was unnaturally pale, stretched tight over his bones. Johnny saw him too. He raised his rifle, but before he could aim, the figure vanished, like smoke dispersing in the wind. "What the hell was that?" Johnny gasped, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "But we need to get out of here. Now." We didn't wait. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, our boots pounding against the earth. The chanting grew louder, the words twisting in the air around us, filling our ears with that ancient, angry sound. Suddenly, I tripped, falling hard against the ground. My rifle slipped from my hands as I scrambled to get up, but something was holding me down, something cold and heavy. I looked down and saw a hand, a pale, bony hand, gripping my ankle. It was him. His empty eyes stared up at me from the earth, his mouth moving silently as he chanted the same cursed words. His grip tightened, the bone of his fingers digging into my skin. I screamed, kicking at him with all my strength, and finally, his hand released me. I stumbled to my feet, my ankle burning with cold, and ran. We burst out of the trees, panting, just as the sun began to sink behind the horizon. Johnny threw open the truck door, and we both jumped inside, slamming the doors shut. "Go! Go!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. Johnny floored the gas, and the truck lurched forward, tearing down the dirt road as fast as it could go. The chanting followed us, growing fainter with each passing mile, but it never truly stopped. Even as we reached the highway and sped back towards town, I could still hear it, faint but persistent, like a distant memory that refused to fade. Johnny didn't say a word the entire ride home, and I didn't blame him. We both knew what we'd seen, what we'd felt, but neither of us could explain it. There was no rational explanation for the cold grip on my ankle, the empty eyes that stared up at me from the ground, or the ancient chant that still echoed in my mind. It wasn't until later, when I was home and trying to sleep, that I remembered something my grandfather had told me when I was a kid. He'd warned me about the spirits that lived in the old forests, the spirits of those who had died angry, betrayed, or forgotten. He'd called them restless. They didn't care who you were or what you were doing. If you disturbed their sacred ground, they would make sure you paid the price. The next morning, I noticed something on my ankle, a bruise, in the shape of a hand. The nightmares started that very night. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. In the dream, I was back in the forest. I could hear the chanting, the same guttural voice from before, but this time it was closer, louder. I was running, just like before, but no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't escape him. The Native American spirit, Red Feather, as I started calling him, was always there, just behind me. His empty eyes bore into my soul, and the chanting, it felt like it was carving into my mind. I tried to brush it off as just the trauma from that day in the woods, but night after night, the same dream haunted me. I couldn't sleep for more than a few hours without waking up, drenched in fear. The worst part was the bruise on my ankle. It hadn't faded. If anything, it had darkened, deepening into the shape of a hand gripping me. Every time I looked at it, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, as if his hand was still there, clutching me, dragging me back. By the end of the week, I was a wreck. Exhausted, anxious, unable to concentrate on anything but the ever-present sense of dread that clung to me. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep so it could come for me again. Johnny wasn't much help either, he was avoiding me, probably trying to pretend none of it had ever happened. I waited for Sunday like a drowning man waits for air. My family always went to church, and though I'd never been deeply religious, I knew I needed help. The church had always been a place of comfort, but this time, it was my last hope. That morning, I pulled Pastor Jim aside after the service. He was a kind man, with a steady gaze and a firm handshake, the kind of person you just trusted. When I showed him the bruise, his eyes widened, and he drew in a slow breath. This isn't something to take lightly," he said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "What happened to you?" I told him everything, about the woods, the spirit, the chanting, the nightmares. As I spoke, I could see the seriousness in his eyes deepen. When I finished, he nodded and told me to wait while he gathered the congregation. I didn't know what to expect, but part of me was terrified that whatever had happened in those woods wasn't done with me yet. When Pastor Jim returned, he brought the entire church with him. We gathered in a circle, and I stood in the middle. He asked me to kneel, and I did, trembling as he laid his hand on my shoulder. The whole congregation joined hands, and they began to pray. The prayers started softly at first, Pastor Jim's voice clear and strong as he called upon God to protect me, to cleanse me of whatever darkness had latched onto my soul. But soon, the others joined in, their voices rising in unison, echoing through the small church like a wave of warmth and light. The intensity grew, and with it, a sensation I hadn't felt in days, a sense of peace. I felt something shift inside me, something heavy being lifted, like a chain breaking free. The cold grip on my ankle loosened, and for the first time since that day in the woods, I felt like I could breathe again. Pastor Jim's voice rose above the rest, commanding whatever spirit had attached itself to me to leave, to release me in the name of Jesus Christ. The air in the room grew thick, and I could almost feel the presence, the same dark, oppressive energy from the woods, fighting to hold on. But the prayers continued, louder, stronger, until finally, I felt it snap. It was as if a door had slammed shut. The cold that had followed me, that lingering sense of being watched, was suddenly gone. The bruise on my ankle. It faded right before my eyes, the dark handprint lightening until it was nothing more than a faint shadow, and then, it disappeared completely. When I stood up, I felt lighter. The nightmares, the whispers, the fear, it was all gone. That night, I slept for the first time in days without any dreams. No chanting, no empty eyes, no cold grip pulling me back. From that day on, I never heard the whispers again. Whatever had come after me in the woods was gone, banished by the prayers and the faith of those around me. I never went back to those woods, though. Some things, once disturbed, never really leave. And I wasn't about to test whether the spirit of Red Feather was truly gone for good, or just waiting for another chance.